Caroline Brown, and I'm with Brady's Lookout Cider, which is based in the Tamar Valley. So Brady's Lookout Cider, we started back in 2012. My husband Chris was the main driver of the start. My family is based in the Huon, and we were with apples. So my dad used to do a lot of fermenting cider when he was younger, and my husband Chris got talking to him about it. And Chris saw a lot of the different apples around and also in our backyard and decided to try some cider production. So we started small. Some of the initial ferments were good, some of them not so good. It was just trial and error. And then we decided that they were getting better and we'd make a business out of it. So our first commercial release was in 2014. Around that time we also made the decision to study overseas around cider production. We did some market research to look at the particular style that we should centre on, and then we went overseas to perfect our understanding of that and also try the different ciders that were being made and talk to the cider makers over there. We went through to France and Germany and also into the UK. Unfortunately for us, we didn't meet a lot of cider producers that were making the style that we were making, but that didn't mean that we couldn't talk to them about, fermenting the different varieties that they were using and also to understand what they were doing in their own business. So it was very valuable for us. So our ciders are a bit different to other ciders that are commercially available. We make a method champenoise. Essentially that takes us 2 years to make. We're using a traditional champagne method, but using apples as the base instead of grapes. So we do use science a lot at the start of our process and all the way through. What we do at the start is we look at the apple variety and we seek to understand what the sugar acidity levels are in each of the varieties, and then we're making decisions on our blending right at the start of our cider process. Then as we're looking to ferment, we're also doing a wild ferment and also a commercial yeast ferment.
How does that differ?
It differs in the control. So there's very few cider makers who use a wild yeast ferment because you're using the natural yeast that's found on the apple to do that. And as it's a spontaneous ferment, you really don't know what kind of yeasts are going to be predominant. So we're doing a lot more testing, a lot more monitoring through that initial ferment and a lot more control over the timing of when we do that ferment, so it reduces the risk of getting incorrect flavours and a stuck ferment through the process. So we use science all the way through what we're doing with our initial ferment, and then we go into a second ferment in bottle, and again that's a little bit more difficult to control because it's in the bottle, but we're using, like champagne makers do, there's an autolysis that's happening with the cider as it does its second ferment. So it's an unknown. You really don't know what's going to happen through that bottle in that second stage of the ferment until after 12 to 18 months. So that's the exciting part of it, and that's where champagne makers also have the challenge of knowing how you're controlling the environment that those bottles are sitting in to make sure that you're not having anything going wrong in bottle until you start to then have that time frame lapse that you can try that how it's come through with a second ferment. I'm not science trained, and my husband doesn't have a science background either, but he has far more of a natural, logical, mathematical and science mind. For me, with how I work within the business, I've always had to use or understand science from a different perspective. I work in primary industries, so for me it's about an application of science and scientific methods. So I do find some of those scientific publications a little bit difficult to work through, but it's about how I apply and understand that knowledge and then understand it in a practical way through the making and constantly asking questions. And I find that science and how well it's written is how I understand it and apply it a lot easier. So some of the more dense scientific works can be a bit of a challenge for me, but the benefit for being in Tasmania and working with a uni is I know who I can go to. It's all about the connections for me in the science industries and the fermentation industries. That's the beauty of Tasmania. So if you're not sure, you can go and ask a scientist, or you can go and ask another fermenter and seek out their knowledge. And the training definitely has helped me in understanding a lot more about how I apply. So we're small at the moment because we do a 2-year ferment. We're in our 3rd release. So there's 2 of us part-time in the business, but when we're doing our processing, we can be up to 4 or 5 on a casual basis. And long term, we're hoping to bring a lot more people into the business once we grow a bit more. There's definitely a lot of science that they will need to bring in, but it's the application of that, and we can always train people. So it's about how they're ready to accept training. There's also marketing and business skills. I'm a great advocate in saying that if your initial discipline might be science, but you need to have a business head to do very well when you're actually out in the real world. So having good skills in business, understanding markets and branding as well as your science, you'll actually do really well in the fermented industries if you've got those skill sets.